So welcome everybody to tonight's lecture. It's the second in our series. It's one we've actually all been looking forward to for quite some time. Many of you will probably already know our speaker quite well, Dr. Andy Margetts, as well as possibly have a copy of his recent book, published with Oxbow, the Wandering Herd, the Medieval Cattle Economy of Southeast England, 450 to 1450. Andy is post-excavation project manager with Archaeology Southeast, and he's worked extensively in the Southeast on numerous projects, particularly in the Weald, and we're very, very fortunate to have him provide us with probably a slightly different angle to his talk tonight. The actual title being slightly revised a couple times, but Medieval Pastoralism in Southeast England, Lessons for Our Landscape. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, and hi everybody. That's a lovely introduction there, and yeah, I mean I've been involved in archaeology now, and the Institute of Archaeology, ASE, for about 20 or so years now, and over that time I've developed a real interest in medieval pastoralism and agriculture, as well as the application of archaeological studies to inform future landscape management. My title today clearly draws upon those topics. So 3 key questions or themes I wish to discuss today are how the Southeast historic landscape has been formed through medieval pastoralism, how historic grazing regimes worked, and how they are being replicated by conservation grazing and rewilding projects, and how nature recovery can be aided by restoration and enhancement of the historic landscape. So what do archaeologists and landscape historians mean when we talk about the historic landscape? The historic environment is the physical manifestation of natural and cultural heritage. The landscapes we see today are formed by thousands of years of human interaction with the environment. From the uplands to the settled valleys, the landscapes testify to both continuity and change, as well as the deep cultural patterns of life which have moulded our landscapes over millennia. When we talk about the historic landscape, it is with an appreciation of the time depth present in our modern countryside, how the countryside has evolved, and how human interference has created regional variation in landscape character. These variations contribute to the beauty of the British countryside while also providing a sense of place. The Southeast comprises the counties of Kent, Surrey, and East and West Sussex. It is an area of reasonably varied topography, with areas of higher relief encompassing the North and South Downs, as well as the central High Weald. Regional variation in landscape has led to Natural England's definition of national character areas. Now, these are based on a combination of landscape, biodiversity, geodiversity, and economic activity. They were designed to follow natural lines in the landscape rather than administrative boundaries, making them a good decision-making framework for the environment. In many ways, the national character areas are based on the much older concept of pays. The term pays comes from the French word for a culturally and environmentally distinctive region. In Britain, their definition has provided a framework for the study of the historic landscape, and all have their own unique environments and histories of settlement. Here we can see the pays of the Southeast. In the centre, we have the semi-upland High Weald. This is surrounded by the heavily wooded clay vale of the Low Weald, which in turn is encompassed by the poor sandy soils of the Greensand Ridge. These areas lie between the opposing chalk escarpments of the North and South Downs. To the east, we have the coastal reclaimed wetlands of Romney Marsh and the Pevensey Levels, and in the south, the rich arable area of the Sussex coastal plain. So let's examine the fundamental landscape characteristics of some of these pays. Owing to its heavy clay soils, the Low Weald has historically been a predominantly pastoral area. It's still densely wooded, with a high proportion of surviving ancient woodland. Many of the more extensive areas of tree cover, such as the Men's and St Leonard's Forest, are a legacy of medieval wood pasture, an environment formed through the communal grazing of livestock. Much of the tree cover is also associated with hedgerows. A large swathe of the Low Weald is comprised of small medieval assart fields carved out of the earlier forest. These are bordered by thick shores, effectively small woodlands formed of coppice with standards and rich in ancient woodland indicators. Blocks of these assarts are bordered by ancient northeast to southwest orientated lanes that originated as droveways for the seasonal movement of animals. Although a significant part of the Western South Downs are wooded, a legacy of medieval hunting preserves and later landed estates, much of the remainder is comprised of close-cropped chalk grassland, home to an incredibly rich and diverse range of plant and insect life. The Green Sand Ridge is characterised by high sandstone escarpments, mixed woodlands and open heath. Fields are predominantly small or medium in size. They form either irregular patterns derived from medieval enclosure or more regular patterns of post-medieval enclosure, often of earlier commons. It has low ridges and narrow vales drained by streams and rivers, some of which retain riparian wetlands and extensive floodplains. Finally, Romney Marsh and the Pevensey levels represent dynamic environments, wetland landscapes with a fluctuating story of loss and reclamation from the sea. Now, as I've already suggested, the historic landscape has formed over thousands of years. Some of the earliest traceable impact of human communities on the landscape dates to the Mesolithic, in Britain from the end of the Ice Age around 10,000 BC right up until about 4,000 BC. Now, during this time, we no longer think of a closed woodland habitat where a squirrel was said to be able to travel from Land's End to John O'Groats without ever touching the ground, but neither was it an entirely open park-like landscape as some have imagined. The picture is more complex and undoubtedly changes over time. What we can be sure of is that alongside animals, humans were actively engaged in modification of the landscape, including the creation of clearings in order to encourage and more effectively hunt wild game. The Mesolithic was followed by the Neolithic, when domesticated plant and animal species were introduced, the first agricultural clearings were created, and large-scale monuments were built. By the Bronze Age, tree clearance really gathered pace, evidenced in a pollen record and significant accumulation of sediment within river valleys. During the later part of the period, extensive field systems were inscribed upon the land. In Sussex, Bronze Age fields covered much of the coastal plain. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, there was a dramatic change in hydrology, which in the west of Britain significantly contributed to peat formation and the large-scale abandonment of uplands. Following a period of decline, by the late Iron Age, agricultural intensification again resumed, continuing into the Roman period. The region effectively became a breadbasket. The South Downs were covered in vast rectilinear field systems, and the Weald, rather than being an impenetrable forest, was actually home to pastoral farming and industry. After the collapse of the Roman Empire and the issuing in of the so-called Dark Ages, there looks to have been a degree of reforestation accompanied by urban and agricultural decay. So following that basic, and in many ways vastly generalised view of the antecedent landscape, from the Middle Anglo-Saxon period, that's around the 7th or 8th centuries, a renewed market economy and state development once again led to agricultural improvement. It's from this time that I'll be mainly concerned with today. The medieval period, I will argue, was fundamental to creation of the historic landscape and the habitats we know. So in defining the medieval period, when am I talking? The early medieval period dates from the end of the Roman occupation until the Battle of Hastings and the Norman invasion of 1066. In the southeast, it is often referred to as the Anglo-Saxon period, and it's broken down into the early, middle, and late phases. This was followed by the High Medieval period from 1066 until the years surrounding the Black Death, and the Late Medieval period from the Black Death until Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. So let's begin to look at pastoralism within our area and how it evolved over time. The first thing to understand about the Southeast is that its story is one of colonisation. It comprises anciently settled landscapes in areas of better arable potential and what are sometimes perceived as more marginal areas, where the prospects of early farming and settlement were not quite so good. The areas of best land, settled early in the medieval period, were on the Sussex coastal plain and the North Kent plain, along the Thames Valley, and at the junction of the North and South Downs with the Greensand Ridge. These last areas are sometimes known in Sussex as the Sussex Spring Line, and in Kent as Holmesdale. By the Middle Anglo-Saxon period, these areas were home to settlements, in Sussex referred to as the Spring Line villages. These were often the centre of Anglo-Saxon territories referred to as estates. But what were the other areas like? Those landscapes away from zones of more permanent settlement. The Anglo-Saxon Weald has often been thought of as a vast, impenetrable forest. Although it was certainly an overwhelmingly woodland area, its story is one of increasing clearance and colonisation as the medieval period progressed. During the Middle Ages, it was probably at its most wooded during the early Anglo-Saxon period. But even then, it would have contained mosaic habitats of more open areas of land, wood pasture, and closed woodland. In the earliest medieval period, Romney Marsh and the Pevensey levels were wetland areas with areas of salt marsh, mudflats, and fen. The Downs, by contrast, had received a good deal of clearance over prehistory. However, the steepest slopes would have still been covered in scrub. Chalk streams and winterbournes were more prevalent than they are today. The most marginal areas, that is the Weald and the coastal wetlands, were areas of what we call seasonal usage. They first existed as common pasture for the kingdom as a whole. Later, there was appropriation of pasture, firstly by so-called folk groups, and later by Anglo-Saxon multiple estates. During the 10th and 11th centuries, use of certain areas had become institutionalised into closed seasonal pastures, sometimes known as dens. So if you imagine a circle is the Weald during the early Anglo-Saxon period, this was a time when the area was intercommunable by the kingdom as a whole. The only areas excluded from communal use of the forest belonged to the kings. By the Middle Anglo-Saxon period, parts of the Weald became associated with folk groups through a process of customary usage. Later still, specific pastures became appropriated by estates and ultimately manors. These seasonal pastures were often termed dens, wicks, or folds. The dens have most often been associated with the early medieval husbandry of swine. In the autumn and early winter, herders would use drove roads to take their pigs to wood pasture to be fed on acorns, beech nuts, and other mast. Pannage meant both the pasturing itself and the dues paid by tenants and others for the right to send their pigs to graze. It involved the autumnal feeding of swine in order to fatten them for slaughter. The detached pannage system was a means of risk spreading and maximising resources. It was an effective way of employing underutilised land while separating livestock from the community's corn. Pigs would have been costly and in many ways detrimental to keep on the home settlements all year round. And modern science has illustrated the benefits of the mast diet to pork in terms of flavour and fat content. Think of the Iberico ham of Spain and Portugal. Medieval pigs were an unimproved, leggy and hairy type, one with long snouts, not dramatically different from wild boar. They were capable of being driven the 15 to 20 kilometres to the commons during a period of transhumance. In terms of the length of the pannage season, most commentators agree that it ran between August and December. However, after the Norman conquest, an October to November date became the norm. As part of the medieval agricultural cycle, swine fatting on mast was so synonymous with autumn that it became the standard illustrated calendar depiction for either October, November or November, December. Now, these medieval pictorial representations of swine pannage are particularly helpful in illustrating the practicalities of the method of feeding pigs. Swineherds are shown beating trees to dislodge nuts, shaking the trees, or climbing them to knock down the mast of foraging animals below. The importance of seasonal swine pannage is illustrated by medieval documentary evidence, but also by excavated animal bone assemblages. As part of my research, I've analysed over 80 medieval animal bone assemblages from archaeological sites across the southeast. Now, there are many caveats, but in basic terms, the data shown here illustrates the relative consumption of the three major domesticates across the region for the early medieval period. The percentage of pig remains is above what would be considered normal nationally, and this is probably due to the importance of the weald for the pasturing of swine. Preceding the autumn pannage season, there was a period of summering when wood pasture was utilised for the grazing of cattle. The benefits of alternating pig and cattle grazing in woodlands is well known. Swine effectively clearing up the acorn crop, so poisonous to cattle. This practice is still commonly associated with the New Forest. Cattle can extract a considerable amount of fodder from browse, and it is likely that unimproved medieval breeds can make even more use of poor quality feed. It was this combined feeding of cattle and swine that was essential to the creation and maintenance of wood pasture. An aligned pattern of droveways seen here in the centre of this transect of the southeast shows the routes taken by early medieval herders to the woodland commons. Over time, these routeways developed into wide droves or deep hollow ways. These stretch from the permanent settlements on the Sussex Spring Line to the detached pastures in the heart of the Weald. A shorter set of parallel routes in the west of the transect extends from the Spring Line villages in the area of Bignor and East Lavington to the Mens. Wood pastures such as the Mens and Ebeno Common are a legacy of Anglo-Saxon communal use of the forest. They have been affected by subsequent land use and a widespread decline in grazing, and their environments were no doubt influenced by the antecedent prehistoric and Roman landscape. But it's the Anglo-Saxon period where we can be sure of their operation as wood pasture in its purest form. Indeed, the name of the Weald itself came to have pastoral woodland connotations, and the Old English name of the Mens is testament to its early medieval communal use. Anglo-Saxon place names attest to seasonal pasture in the southeast, as well as the animals themselves. Cattle are included in place names such as Rotherfield, open land of the cattle, or Kema, the cow's mere. On screen is the location of Cowshot Manor on the heaths of the Bagshot series in the Thames basin of Surrey. Cowshot is named Cushitshagen in a surviving 7th century Anglo-Saxon charter. The name effectively means the cow enclosure. This enclosure existed in a landscape of open pasture, and the nearby Anglo-Saxon name of Cow Moor is mentioned in the same 7th century charter. The Old English moor means a barren wasteland, in this case, heathland associated with cattle. The importance of horses to Sussex may be confirmed by way of settlement place names recorded prior to and around the time of Domesday. During this period, Hallam has shown that horse place names were marginally more prevalent than those for cattle, although this does not necessarily mean horses were numerically dominant. It is possible that the earliest references may indicate the greater prestige in which horses were held, or the trade in feral animals dependent on rough grazing rather than more formalised production within enclosed fields. In 1086, a sokeman of the 100 of Kingston in Surrey is recorded as being in charge of woodland mares belonging to the king. And it can be speculated that the 10th century Wealden place name of Horsham relates to an enclosure on the margins of extensive wood pasture and heath used for breeding horses, what is today St Leonard's Forest. Goats too were a feature of the Wealden Woods, although they were never particularly widespread within medieval England. Instances of names such as Gatewick or Gatwick may indicate goat dairying, but the animals were not popular in regions where large numbers of pigs were kept. Their tendency to spoil restricted pasture and damage trees doesn't endear them to some landowners. And as the medieval period progressed, constraints on the keeping of goats began to be recorded. In the customals of the Archbishop of Canterbury, it is documented that the tenants of Slindon who lived in the Weald were to have common with their beasts everywhere except one enclosed wood of the Lord, but no one shall have common with goats. Sheep are not particularly suited to the heavy clays of the Weald. The animals are prone to disease on wet freshwater pasture, being more susceptible to foot rot and liver fluke. The intermediate host of liver fluke found in sheep is often carried by a species of snail. Now, this fact was not lost on later medieval husbandmen, as the 13th century seneschalcy records. At Michaelmas, let all the sheep be drafted out, for those sheep are sound at Easter and in May and before Lammas. Afterwards they can, between the two feasts of Our Lady, by bad keeping, eat the web of the rime and the little white snails from which they will sicken and die. We can be more certain that sheep were kept in the coastal marshes during the early medieval period, the salt water being a preventative against these ailments. Sheep were the most important dairy animal in Anglo-Saxon England, and during the summer, the marshes would have been used for making milk and cheese. Although not as common a dairy animal during the period, marshes were also used for cattle dairying. The medieval agricultural writer, Walter of Henley, tells us of the value that marshland pasture held for the grazing of cattle. He stated that 2 cows fed on salt marsh would yield the same, a weight of cheese and half a gallon of butter, as 3 cows fed on wood pasture, stubbles or meadow after it had been cut. The marshes and creeks on the borders of the Swale in North Kent were used as cattle pasture. Archbishop Walfrid's high payment for a tract of marshland between Faversham Creek and Graveney, known as the King's Cowland, are likely to be indicative of cattle dairies in a wetland context. The payment is recorded in an early 9th century Anglo-Saxon charter, which also refers to the purchase of an estate that included land known in Latin as Campus Armentorum and in English as Heriva Li. Heriva is the Old English for cattle, and these records show that there was a Kentish royal interest in the pasturing of cows. Analysis of early medieval bone assemblages shows the prevalence of sheep during the period. The high downland was certainly being actively exploited as sheep pasture. Domesday records large numbers of shepherds on downland manors. Over 50% of the 3 major domesticates consumed on early medieval downland sites comprised the remains of sheep. By the late Anglo-Saxon period, we can be confident that the prevalence of downland sheep had begun to create the botanically rich chalk grassland we associate with the sheep walk. So moving on into the high medieval period, this was a time of rising population and agricultural innovation. Adoption of advanced crop rotations and improved animal husbandry was a response to the growing urban population and a more sophisticated market economy. Agricultural intensification led to the increased utilisation of more marginal land. This is witnessed on the downland, where medieval arable cultivation pushed up onto the steep slopes, creating plough lynches. This example is from Hawkesbury in Gloucestershire, but similar scenes can be found all over the North and South Downs, with some particularly impressive examples near Poynings in Sussex. This increasing use of more marginal land was also apparent in the Weald, which began to be more permanently settled and occupied by freeholders granted land farmed through a method of convertible husbandry, or infield-outfield. This was a method where fields close to the farm were intensively manured and cropped on a rotational basis, whereas those further away were laid to grass and pasture. The small assart fields that cover much of the Weald are testament to this new colonisation, and many of them owe their origins to the 11th to 13th century. As well as reclamation from woodland, reclamation of marsh really gathered pace during the High Middle Ages, with networks of drainage channels providing a relic of investment by monastic and other communities. The reclamation of Romney Marsh and the Pevensey Levels in particular created vast tracts of rich arable and pasture land. But the best arable areas were parts of North Kent and the Sussex coastal plain. The latter acted as a vast ecclesiastical grain factory, farmed by the open field method of agriculture. The turning over of the Weald towards more permanent occupation led to a gradual decline in the pallage system, as the old seasonal pastures were granted to members of the community willing to carve a holding out of the woods and clays. Nevertheless, in some places, pannage rights continued to exist right up until the 15th century. Cattle took over as the dominant Wealden livestock, becoming essential to the settled Wealden farmer. Not only were oxen the only beast capable of ploughing in the intractable Wealden clays, but the soils also required vast inputs of cattle manure in order to raise an arable crop. Lords and monastic institutions began to see the value of the Weald for the grazing of cattle, creating great specialised cattle ranches known as vaccaries. They sometimes acted as dairies, producing milk, butter and cheese, or as producers of beef cattle, or indeed draft oxen necessary for arable agriculture. These establishments have been seen as a fundamental part of medieval land use and settlement evolution, particularly in areas designated as forest or chase. One of the key characteristics of a vacary site is an oval enclosure. When a certain number of criteria come together, it's possible to actually discern vacary sites. Here we have the example of Chelwood Vettery on Ashdown Forest in Sussex, a vacary that was owned by the Augustinian monks of Micklen Priory and featured an oval enclosure and a vacary place name. At the Vatry on the Surrey-Sussex border, a medieval cattle enterprise was again characterised by an oval enclosure, one that was later converted into a hunting park for deer. A report of inquisition within the Canterbury Cathedral archives explicitly mentions the presence of a Kentish vacary. Here we can see that the tenants of the 100 of Marden should repair the house of a cow pasture, a vicaria, called Cow House in the manor of Milton Regis. Despite such explicit evidence, some eminent historians have remained rather resistant to the idea of vaccaries in the southeast, the establishments being more traditionally associated with northern uplands. This resistance is also born of a historic emphasis on the importance of medieval sheep and those landscapes where sheep pasture was dominant. Nevertheless, we have already explored how much of the Weald was unsuited to sheep, and during the high medieval period, the animals were completely excluded from Ashdown Forest, where documentary evidence conversely shows thousands of cattle were grazed. With the increasing importance of wool and a large monastic interest in sheep farming, use of the downland as sheep walk only intensified during the high medieval period. On the South Downs in particular, the farming of large numbers of sheep became key to the Sussex method of sheep corn husbandry. This comprised periodic open pasturing on the downland and subsequent folding of sheep on arable land that bordered the downs. Trampling by the sheep's hoofed helped create a tilth, and their manure maintained the fertility of the cornland. The lucrative nature of high medieval sheep farming meant that lords too became interested in the keeping of flocks. The specialised medieval cattle ranches, the vaccaries, had their equivalent sheep establishments named beccaries. These comprised long, narrow buildings used for sheltering animals over the winter, storing fodder and lambing. They also had administrative functions and could serve as sources of manure in the spring. They're little studied in the southeast, although documentary evidence attests to their presence on the downland, such as the Earl of Arundel's sheepcote at Preston. The transition between the high and late medieval period was marked by a demographic collapse, including factors such as the Black Death, endemic warfare, climatic changes, and large-scale flooding. The latter included the destruction of some coastal plain villages, massive coastal erosion coupled with inundation of the marshes. These would later become the subject of re-reclamation. To an extent, these factors halted the expansion of agriculture into so-called marginal areas. Those field systems that had pushed up onto the downs became abandoned and turned over to the sheep walk. There was also abandonment of isolated downland settlements, and many newly colonised landscapes, such as the Weald, experienced a loss of farmsteads. Abandoned holdings were a boon to neighbours who were able to purchase farms whose owners had been lost to the plague. Medieval hunting parks had flourished through the high medieval period and reached their zenith by the late Middle Ages. I love this depiction of the medieval park from the Master of Game held by the Bodleian Library. I think we can see two species of deer, perhaps fallow and red in the centre there. A roe deer can be seen off to the bottom right. There's a wild boar, I think a fox or pine marten, badger and otter. I love the badger and the otter's webbed feet. There's a rabbit, perhaps some kind of ermine, and a wildcat at the top. And in the very centre here, is this a wolf or a dog? The recovery of agriculture and settlement would go on through the post-medieval period. The major changes not come until the agricultural revolution and the later intensifications caused by the industrial era. This, of course, includes chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, hunting and predator control, leading to biodiversity loss, the ploughing up of chalk grassland, and increasing mechanization and soil degradation. So I hope this potted history of medieval pastoralism has given you some sense of the changes that occurred over the medieval period and how these were fundamental to the creation of the South East historic landscape. Though denuded through millennia of human interference and environmental factors such as natural cycles of climate change, the landscapes were still biodiverse in comparison to the post-industrial countryside. Mixed, often low-intensity agriculture, where communal farming and pastoral landscapes also played a key role in the system of land management, meant there was a mosaic of habitats. Medieval hunting grounds too ensured there were wild places where non-domesticated animals were given space. My hope is that we can learn from historical forms of land management to help support biodiversity and aid sustainability. Both nationally and internationally, communities face the problems of anthropogenic climate change, depleted soils, pollution, and depleting wildlife, all within the backdrop of rising populations, a need for space, and increased food production. These challenges confront everyone, and it is our collective responsibility to forge the best outcomes through informed decision-making. Through the medium of archaeological and paleoecological studies, heritage professionals have been able to chart the sometimes dramatic processes that have altered Britain's landscape and in turn its associated plant and animal communities. It is often perceived that farming in particular has been detrimental to nature and biodiversity, as well as the health of our countryside. Certainly this appears to be the case with some post-industrial land use, where chemical fertilisers, pesticides and herbicides, together with mechanisation and monoculture, has led to ecological impacts and soil degradation. Over the last 200 years, this, as well as irresponsible forms of fishing, hunting and predator control, has perhaps had the greatest impact on Britain's wildlife. In contrast to much modern farming, medieval agriculture was, in many ways, geared towards sustainability and relied on natural inputs, focused on soil health and the carrying capacity of the land. Risk spreading was essential to the medieval farmer due to the vagaries of weather and the long-term need to create viable, resilient holdings. We must remember there was no access to vets, pesticides, herbicides, or antibiotics. It could never be suggested that direct aping of medieval farming could solve modern environmental issues. But by studying past pastoral, arable, or mixed regimes, we can position ourselves to inform future developments and take the best elements from past land use and apply them in suitable contexts. It must be remembered that some species thrive alongside traditional agricultural regimes and that sustainable farming is essential to humanity's survival. The South East heathlands, wooded commons and sheep crop downland are all a product of human intervention. The British countryside is composed of distinctive cultural landscapes which contribute to the beauty and diversity of the countryside whilst also providing this sense of place. These landscapes all evolved over time. Nevertheless, their essential characteristics often owe their foundations to particular medieval land uses and agricultural practices. Within South East England, the sheep-corn husbandry of the South Downs and the exploitation of the weald as wood pasture left a legacy in the morphology and ecology of the landscape. These historic landscapes accentuate certain environments that in turn encourage certain species. Locations that are today a target for nature recovery are often inherited from fragments of historic land use that once characterised wider geographical areas. It is frequently the case that these fragments escaped the agricultural improvers of the 18th and 19th centuries as their environments were perceived to be just too extreme to warrant investment. They could also be a legacy of elite hunting preserves or landed estates. Alternatively, they are sometimes inherited from landscapes where the history of communal farming was so strong that older forms of land use maintained an adequate defence against agricultural conversion, such as late post-medieval enclosure. Habitats, cultural and historic landscapes thus evolved in tandem, and it may be possible to suggest that enhancement or revival of the essential characteristics of a particular landscape holds the key to local nature recovery. Some pioneering rewilding initiatives, such as the Oostvaardersplassen, began with a blank canvas in terms of an underlying historic landscape. The project was sited on an area of polderland in the Netherlands, only reclaimed from the sea in 1968. British ecological projects, such as NEP by contrast, are often implanted on a pre-existing historic landscape and should therefore be undertaken sensitively and holistically and with careful consideration of what is already there. In the case of NEP, once an understanding of the essential elements of the Weald's historic landscape are applied, it is arguable that the project actually enhances and restores important elements of the character of the region, i.e. wood pasture. So in my opinion, conservation grazing and rewilding projects are in many ways replicating the medieval land uses that were fundamental to creation of the historic landscape. As a case study, when we consider the conservation grazing efforts of the Sussex Wildlife Trust at the Wealden site of Ebenow Common, here we might be able to demonstrate the combined opportunity to not only restore and enhance essential elements of the historic landscape, but also aid biodiversity and nature recovery. As I hope I've shown, the essential elements of the historic landscape of the Weald is wood pasture. The historic decline of grazing at Ebenow meant that the wood pasture habitat became overgrown. When Sussex Wildlife Trust bought the reserve in 1980, there was a conscious effort to open up the woodland and restore grazing to the reserve. I believe that cattle were fundamental in this process. There are a number of conservation reasons for keeping cattle in woodlands. These include the benefits to biodiversity by reducing tree and scrub regeneration, maintaining open habitats, and by decreasing dominant plant species. Conservation managers who wish to encourage a range of ancient and semi-natural woodland types have encouraged lower stocking densities, something that was clearly managed by medieval farmers by way of stints, small herd sizes, and restrictions on the month and length of grazing. For restoration of lowland wood pasture and maintenance of parkland environments, a higher grazing intensity is usually recommended. Though browsing and grazing in glades would have provided the majority of wood pasture forage for cattle, pollard or tree hay could also provide an alternative feed when other fodder was scarce. Branches from trees in leaf were cut at the peak of the growing season and stored for winter feed. The branches were typically harvested during the late summer. As a ruminant, cows are able to extract more nutrition from lesser quality fodder, and beech, ash, elm, holly and ivy were probably all cut to feed cattle over the winter months. Coppiced wood could also be grazed by cattle once the stalls had grown above browsing height. The value of coppice depended on the management cycle, but generally it improved grazing by opening up the canopy, providing space and light to the woodland floor. Both pigs and cattle require careful management in order that we benefit from their various advantages and so as not to disrupt the sensitive ecology of the forest. The medieval method of alternate grazing of pigs and cattle at Ebenow could be available in terms of swine's ability to reduce poisonous acorns, but also for assisting woodland regeneration. Medieval husbandmen achieved this in three ways. First, by the planting and encouragement of mast-bearing trees. Secondly, by the loosening of soil through the rooting activities of swine, creating ideal germination conditions for saplings. And thirdly, by that trampling of cattle, which can help reduce bracken cover. From a land management perspective, Foraging swine have also shown benefits in terms of their impact on the biology of the forest floor. Although grazing of pigs may be beneficial for open wood pasture environments, when grazed in large numbers in confined spaces, they cause colluviation and they inhibit reforestation, ultimately causing the disappearance of woodland. Obviously, numbers need to be adjusted to the size of the available woodland. The grazing of both enclosed spaces and more extensive wood pastures was a particular feature of the medieval period within the southeast. Now, of course, it's up to land managers to decide if this system is feasible, but if implemented, it may be wise to apply snout rings to restrict damage to older vegetation and prevent pigs from digging their way out of enclosures. So-called virtual fencing could also be considered as a means of controlling free-ranging livestock. These measures may be a modern means of replacing the medieval pig herder and livestock commoner. Modern technologies and approaches can alleviate the problems of a labour deficit in comparison to the older use of the commons. Change is perhaps the only constant in history. Archaeologists and heritage professionals are often perceived as wanting to preserve the world in aspic. In fact, the conservation work we do is actually all about the careful management of change. The degradation of our current environment needs to be addressed, and we're in the process of finding a new way. But I would argue that path can be informed by the lessons of the past. Fundamental aspects of our historic landscape can be enhanced, and that process in turn can enhance habitats leading to nature recovery. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Andy. That was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, fascinating. And I think we're quite lucky that you, I suppose, had the opportunity to add in all those extra lessons and what we can sort of take from it for sort of, well, future work. I mean, I probably would start out asking, I mean, is there already some work underway? Or, you know, have you been taking some of these ideas, going to Sussex, you know, Wildlife Trust or any of the other organizations with some proposals or collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I'm already in sort of dialogue with the Sussex Wildlife Trust and yeah, in consultation with them and hoping to give a similar talk in April, so that maybe we can start building some bridges between what I see as there's been historically maybe some kind of misconception about what we want to do as archaeologists and landscape historians in terms of how we perceive the countryside. And as I said in the closing slides of that talk, you know, we're not talking about preserving the historic landscape in aspic. You know, that change is almost the status quo in our history. And yeah, I really want to work with the Sussex Wildlife Trust and others in showing how, you know, past practices have value. You know, we can learn from the past. I think we've forgotten quite a lot since the in the post-industrial era about how to work sustainably. This was something that was being achieved by medieval and earlier agriculturalists, and I think we've got a lot to learn, and heritage professionals have a lot to provide in these new ways that we're trying to address some of the problems that we face as humanity. Really, we've certainly got to find a new way, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to listen to the lessons of the past.
Absolutely, yeah. Right, so I'm just going to go, if you don't, well, you can probably look at the chat yourself, but I'll read the question for everyone to be able to see. So the question is, what was the low wheeled land used for before reclamation? Were there areas bypassed or used for woodland pasture?
Yeah, so certainly during the medieval period, I think we're still in an early in our understanding of the Weald during prehistory and the Roman period, but certainly during those times, it's far more utilised than what we once, how we once perceived it. Certainly the Middle Iron Age and the Late Iron Age seem to be periods of, the Middle Iron Age seems to be a sort of expansion of Weald and colonisation at that point, and the Late Iron Age, it seems, an early Roman period, it seems to be fairly well settled, probably used for cattle, but also, mixed farming as well. That's the kind of antecedent landscape that we're just starting to build a picture of now. But during that early Anglo-Saxon period that I was talking about, you need to kind of envision this intercommunable area. It hadn't been, the population was quite small at that time. And there was this vast resource, maybe not the best land to settle when you've only got a small population. So you would have used those best arable areas first. And during the early Anglo-Saxon period, the Weald would have been an area of seasonal usage. But at first, it was an intercommunable area by the kingdom as a whole. So if you imagine the kingdom of Sussex or the kingdom of Kent, it would have been sort of almost fair game for the groups that were wanting to exploit it. There were areas that were severed from the communal use of the forest, and they belonged to the kings. But I think we should be wary about how we perceive that, even that earliest intercommunable area. I don't think it was a blanket woodland. There would have been areas that were still relatively clear, which were a legacy of earlier use. So, Roman use of the Weald would have left a legacy in that area. We have names such as birch and ash, which is almost a recognition that land was being recolonised by coloniser species such as, birch within birch and ash. And that is probably representative, and some of the feld names as well, that's probably representative of more open areas within the Weald. So we shouldn't, even in the earliest stages, we shouldn't think of the Weald as this blanket forest. It certainly had more open areas, but wood pasture would have been the dominant environment. Then there's a process of appropriation as the Anglo-Saxon period moves on. We have those folk groups, the Hastingas, places start to be customarily used by these groups and become associated with them. That's the Hastingas, it's part of the Weald. Then there's another stage again towards the end of the Anglo-Saxon period when people start to appropriate individual pastures within this communal use. And that's when we get the formation of the dens, the wicks and the folds.
So we have another question about whether cattle were grazed on the downs during any period, and tied to that, were they more or less exclusively grazed, by sheep, the chalk downs?
I think our perception has become, because of the prevalence of sheep on the downland, which is indisputable. I think maybe our perception of the downland usage has become slightly skewed. I think that certainly in areas where there's access to river valleys, the South Downs would have been used for cattle pasture. So cattle are incredibly water reliant. So, the high chalk downland is not necessarily suited to cattle. We can create things like dew ponds and such like, which can be exploited by cattle. But to me, it's those river valleys, the downland river valleys where you would have seen cattle pasturing. Also, we must remember that the downland was also crossed by more streams and winterbournes than it is today. You know, water extraction since the post-industrial era, that's created a real change in the hydrology of the downs. So when we think about streams such as or rivers such as the Lavant, you know, that would have been a more strongly flowing watercourse during the medieval period. And so there were more habitats that were exploitable by cattle than there are today, even though, you know, we've artificially able to more widely pasture cattle on a downland today, but that's through, you know, troughs, you know, and pumped water and dew ponds rather than, you know, it's an artificial thing. But cattle were certainly pastured on the downs, and I think that our vision of the downs has become slightly skewed by the undoubted dominance of sheep.
Okay, so we have another sort of comment from Linda just about a Caesar's camp, so a bank enclosed area that she was told was probably for a medieval deer park. Do you think there were many of these parks in medieval times? You know, and as I say, she just hadn't thought it was considered a way of raising animals for food before.
Yeah, so again, like our perception of medieval parks has been slightly skewed in terms of, you know, their association with deer. So parks were primarily for hunting deer and display and all the rest of it, but they were also pastoral reserves. Lords could gain an income by renting grazing out to their tenants or others. So parks would have been populated by more than just deer, and that goes for wild species as well. But certainly domesticated livestock were pastured within medieval deer parks, and that was a source of that was beneficial to both lords and tenants. You know, there's extra grazing reserve there. You know, grazing's valuable. It provided an income to lords, but so then we have to think about the kind of environments that what medieval deer parks were, and other beasts of the chase also existed within deer parks. You know, that lovely picture I showed there from the Master of the Game, that illustrated manuscript that's held in the Bodleian Library, that gives a real sense of, you know, some of the, you know, not every park would have had all those different species of animals in, but it gives you some sense of the medieval perception of what these spaces were all about.
Excellent. Right, I'm turning over to Martin, who's heard your whole talk, and he has a couple questions.
Hi, Martin.
Hi, Andy.
Hey.
Thank you very much for a good talk. That was really interesting.
That's very kind. Cheers.
No, it was good. I mean, you went into a really great deal of depth over, you know, a really long time period. It was nice. You may imagine I'm quite interested in your zooarchaeological data, and I had two questions. One is, were you able to pick out any chronological changes? That's sort of late Roman going through to sort of the later medieval period. I know you showed one graph which kind of covered all of the early medieval. I'll let you answer that one first. Yeah,
so you know, unlike yourself, I'm not a zooarchaeologist, so I think I could possibly be accused of using zooarchaeological data in a rather superficial way. Certainly for my study on the cattle economy of the southeast, I've shown that chronological change over time, and the changes in the sort of percentage of cattle and the fluctuations as the medieval period progressed. I've just started doing some work on, so for that project, I use a rather different time frame. So I used a time frame that was geared towards economic changes, really. So I didn't really see the early medieval period as a coherent time in terms of economy, because the early early Anglo-Saxon period and middle Anglo-Saxon period are quite different to the late Anglo-Saxon period, which might have more in common with the high medieval period in terms of a developed market economy. So I used a slightly different time frame for that study of the cattle economy in particular, but for the table that I showed there and the more recent work that I've done, where I've gone back to the traditional period based, you know, early medieval, high medieval, late medieval, that's early stages of research at the moment. But that one table is is representative, I think, of a kind of agglomeration of sites across the southeast, this kind of big data approach, which I think is quite valuable in, I don't know what your thoughts on it are, Martin, but I think it's quite valuable in looking at regional, I mean, certainly with your Roman rural settlement project, big data was quite key in that. And I think there's quite a valuable way at looking at regionalisation.
Yeah, I think what you showed was a nice baseline for that period against which you could put the rest of your, you know, your historical evidence against, which was really nice. I mean, you know, the high pig percentages came across really nicely. I was wondering, because you were talking about horses as well, is there any, how did horse remains relate to the frequencies of the major livestock? I hadn't seen that for the medieval period in that region.
I haven't looked at horse remains. I've only looked at the three major domesticates. So yeah, I'd like to. You know, I think there's some important work to be done on medieval horses, particularly in Sussex, where we know that kings had medieval studs at Ditchling.
Yeah.
You know, that there's a wealth of research to be done on livestock within the southeast region, I think.
I mean, certainly with horses, and you showed it quite nicely in some of the pictures of them being grazed in that area. I was just interested to see whether we could pick that up in some of the excavated evidence. But yeah, certainly an area I'd go for. But no, thanks very much. Really interesting talk.
Thank you.